Hi, I'm Malika Bilal in for Femi OK, and you're in the stream. More than 50 years ago, U.S. activists succeeded in passing legislation to protect minority voting rights. But new controversial voter restrictions have some asking, has the country regressed? The U.S. state of Arizona recently made headlines after thousands of people were forced to wait in line for hours to vote in the presidential primary. So digital producer Omar Badar is here to break down what happened.
That's right, Malika. In one county, lines wrapped around street corners, causing some voters to walk away. But many stood their ground, even hours after the polls officially closed. This happened because the county reduced the number of polling stations by 70%, a move said to save some money. There were also more polling locations in predominantly white neighborhoods than in minority ones, prompting some to suggest that the election was rigged. While waiting in line, they took to Twitter to vent their frustration using hashtag voter suppression and hashtag AZElectionFraud. Others shared photos of how they dealt with the long wait, with some even having pizza delivered to them. Online, many across the country shared words of encouragement to those hoping to cast their ballots. The mayor of Phoenix has since called for an investigation over what happened, and there's even a White House petition demanding the Obama administration investigate what took place that day. Petition currently has more than 210,000 signatures. But we want to know what you think. Was this a case of voter fraud or just an election mishap? Tweet us. The hashtag is AJStream.
Looking forward to those tweets. Now, many blame what happened in Arizona on the U.S. Supreme Court's change of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The landmark legislation was passed to prevent racial discrimination in voting. But in 2013, the Supreme Court declared a provision of the act unconstitutional. The provision had required states and counties with deep histories of racial discrimination to request federal approval before changing their election laws. Well, the ruling paved the way for more controversial voter ID laws, making it harder for minorities and low-income individuals to register. Critics argue these roadblocks prevent growing minority populations from having a voice. But those in favor say they are intended to protect the integrity of the electoral process. The 2016 presidential race is the first in 50 years in which there won't be full protections of the Voting Rights Act. So what impact will this have on voters in this year's election? To help us talk about this, we're joined by Barbara Arnwine. She's a civil rights activist and the president of the Transformative Justice Coalition here in Washington, D.C. In New York, Ari Berman, a senior writer at The Nation magazine. Tomas Robles, the co-executive director of Living United for Change in Arizona. And Bob Ballinger, a state representative for the state of Arkansas. Welcome to the stream, everyone. Tomas, you were among those who were trying to vote in Arizona. What did you experience?
I experienced the very form of voter suppression that we're talking about. I am actually on the permanent early voting list, which is a mail-in ballot, and I did not actually receive my ballot. So I actually had to go and wait at a precinct and fill out a provisional ballot, which doesn't even count until up to 2 weeks after the elections. In addition, we had members of my own family who did not receive a ballot and did not get a chance to vote. And what we saw is just huge lines in the largest county. 21,000 voters per polling location is what ended up being the final tally. And most of those polling locations that were closed were in communities of color. And so what we've seen is we saw the fact that the Voting Rights Act had been gutted a few years ago to the voter ID laws that have been passed. And along with budget cuts, we have now seen this year what all those years of voter suppression bills and all the consequences coming from that has come to fruition. And what we saw is people being turned away at the polls, people being forced to wait hours, up to 4 hours in line, and some didn't even get to vote until about 11 p.m. And so what we're seeing here is now people here in Arizona is that we're literally trying to suppress the vote now. And so we took food to many people standing in line. We were bringing water to many citizens that needed help. Some senior citizens, we brought chairs so they could sit down. And it's just been a very, very embarrassing sight, if you will, because of the fact that now the light is continuing to shine in Arizona in a negative way, and it's directly related to the Voting Rights Act being gutted.
Tomas, were you eventually able to vote, and how long did it take you?
My vote still has not been counted, actually. It's a provisional vote, so hopefully by next week it'll count. But many of my family members did not get to vote, and many of our constituents from our organization were not able to vote as well.
So Malika, we have a lot of people weighing in online, not just on the difficulty of voting, but also on the difficulty of actually registering to vote. So we have stories over here like SMJ who says, voter ID laws have made it difficult for my mother-in-law to get a driver's license when she moved to Texas. 6 forms of ID required plus proof of marriage. She's a veteran, so that made things even more complicated. So, Bob, I know that it's going to be difficult to talk about specific cases when we don't have all the information about them, but would you agree that in many places it is a little too difficult to actually register to vote because of so many laws that are on the books?
I don't think so. I think that the idea that a citizen would say that, going through and even jumping through a couple of hoops in order to have the right to vote or in order to be able to exercise their vote, I think a person ought to be able to show that commitment to do it. And one thing, going back to the issue in Arizona that I think people ought to talk about is, if there was voter suppression and voter fraud, why? Who is being victimized? Was it the Clinton administration that was working behind the scenes, or was it Bernie Sanders? In this case, I think that, oftentimes let's not forget that sometimes people are nefarious, but sometimes people just make stupid mistakes. And if they didn't have enough, they didn't realize that there was going to be huge voter turnout, and they didn't have enough location and polling places, that has nothing to do with trying to suppress the vote. That has to do with people, not making the right decisions. And so, if it is voter suppression, who's being victimized and why? Was it the Clinton administration doing it?
Well, there's a problem with Bob's explanation, and that problem is that.
All right, I hear you. Let's hear from Barbara and then get to you.
The problem is that we had problems in Arizona in 2010, problems in Arizona in 2012. These problems of not having enough equipment, not having enough ballots, of long lines, of suppression against Latino population. These are not new issues. And what I am happy in one regard that the United States, that people got to see what we've been watching for years now in Arizona, is its hostility to its Latino, its African American, and its Native American voters. And we have had, flaw after flaw after flaw in the election administration in Arizona that has been injurious to the voters there. So this is not new, it's just the worse. And I'm glad that the attention was on this election.
I'd like to add to that too, and completely disagree with Bob's statement. Is one, it's the state legislature who is completely Republican and the governor who cut the budgets to reduce the amount of pollings. It's the Republican Helen Purcell, who is in charge of the Maricopa County Recorder's Office, who chose to cut from 200 polling locations down to 60, predominantly in places and people of color. This is the same legislature who wanted to pass legislation to make it so you had to prove your citizenship that was struck down by the Supreme Court. This is the same legislature who forces folks to get an ID and closes DMV locations and forces people of color, especially poor people, to third-party DMVs that charge much higher fees to get these IDs. In addition, when we're talking about these voter suppression laws that states are pushing out, let's not forget that Arkansas's law was struck down by its own Supreme Court for being too difficult. This is the United States of America, where we prided ourselves on democracy, and the fact that we want to be proud that we're keeping people from voting is insulting to the process and the Constitution that we created over 200 years ago.
Ari, I heard you wanting to jump in. I just want to throw a couple of things from our online community at you and see your response to them. We have Whomerican over here who says what's happening right now is disenfranchisement of minorities, as voter fraud and impersonation is non-existent. Blacks and Hispanics are least likely to have ID. But then we have some pushback over here from Michael, who says, yes, the ID laws are impacting the homeless and those who lost their IDs and those who truly are not citizens. However, we're talking about less than 1% of voters who are being affected by this. Can you talk a little bit about how many people are actually impacted by these laws and whether it is just a small negligible number?
So the first thing I want to say is with regards to Arizona, this voting change, the reduction of polling places, would have never occurred if the Supreme Court had not gutted the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you.
Because Arizona was one of those states with a long history of voting discrimination that had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. So regardless of why Maricopa County reduced 70% of polling places, Bob, can you please let me finish? No one interrupted you when you were talking, okay? Stop interrupting everybody, and we'll let you talk in a second.
I'm not very good at this.
Bob's being good-natured about it. So Ari, let's you finish your point, and then we'll get to Bob. Go ahead, Ari.
So the point is that regardless of why Maricopa County wanted to make this change, they would have had to submit it for federal approval. I don't believe that the Justice Department would have approved this because minority voters were 40% of Maricopa County,
That's right.
and there was clear evidence that there were no polling places or only one polling place in predominantly Latino areas. So I think this clearly impacted minority voters disproportionately. This is the very type of thing that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act blocked historically. The second thing I'll say in terms of voter ID laws is that if you look at a place like North Carolina or a place like Texas, about 5% of registered voters don't have a government-issued ID. Black and Hispanic voters are more likely than whites not to have a government-issued ID. To get a government-issued ID, you need underlying documents in many cases, like a birth certificate, which costs money. If you were born at home in the segregated South, you may have never gotten a birth certificate. So I've been tracking many, many stories from places like North Carolina, from places like Texas, of people who had been voting for 70 years who now can no longer cast a ballot because of these laws. And there's been no evidence of voter impersonation to justify them. In North Carolina, there's only been 2 cases of voter impersonation from 2000 to 2010 out of 35 million ballots cast. But in the 2014 election, there were 2,300 voters turned away from the polls because of these new restrictions.
So Ari, I want to give Bob. I want to
impacted.
give Bob a chance to respond. But Bob, I actually want to throw something else at you because it kind of picks up on what Ari was saying. I want you to take a look at a clip from a People in Power documentary airing here on Al Jazeera, and they talk about what's different about these voter ID laws today. Have a look.
They implemented a voter ID law. They knew would disenfranchise a lot of poor people and a lot of older people.
Katrina Norris Carter is the coordinator of the annual Selma Bridge Crossing Jubilee. What's different about the voter ID law compared to how people could vote in the past?
In the past, you'd have your Social Security card, power bill, just something that showed you were a resident of Alabama.
Republicans argue that a voter ID is needed to combat fraudulent voting. But a study found that a person is more likely to be struck by lightning than impersonate another voter.
So Bob, is fraud a thing here? Is it a big thing, really?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in my opinion, the idea of an individual either having confidence in their vote and that's really being counted compared to the idea of someone, cheating the system, committing fraud. I mean, to me, I think that I want to make sure that my vote is counted. And if it's going to be offset by 3 people who are out there committing fraud, that means that my vote is unimportant.
So, a lot of people are saying that basically these new voter ID laws are suppressing the vote.
Yes.
But we actually have somebody who disputes that. We got a video comment from Dan Greenberg online. Take a listen to this.
This is something that's replicated many times, that after you have voter ID established, there's a huge increase in turnout. And this is not the case in places that don't have voter ID. And so I think this probably has something to do with the fact that people feel like it's a matter of ballot integrity. They are more sure that their vote is going to get counted.
Well, see, that's the problem. People want to talk about anecdotal evidence, but fortunately, there's a new study out. January of this year, 2016, the University of California, San Diego has issued an actual, factual, scientific, quantitative study that looks at voter turnout and voter ID laws. And what it finds is that voter turnout is impacted negatively, especially for minorities, people of mixed race, during primaries primarily. That primaries is one area where the turnout for racial minorities goes down significantly. The study also looks at the general elections. There's not a lot of data yet, but it does see some downtick. So I want us to be very clear that people can talk all the anecdotes they want to, but let's look at the real factual evidence here. In some respects, this whole thing about less than, not even 1% of any evidence of voter fraud allowing states then to pass laws that knock out, 5-10% of their voters, not to mention the people who get discouraged and don't even show up to try to vote. I mean, this is a danger to our democracy. Think about it. We've had a democracy for centuries. The whole 20th century was about expanding the right to vote, women the right to vote, the 1965 Civil Rights Act, lowering the voting age to 18. All of these things were expanding the franchise. And now all of a sudden, as the franchise has been changing demographically, more people of color, more liberal, quote, students, then all of a sudden we're seeing laws that are putting those populations in their crosshairs to knock them out. And let's be clear, 16 million people nationwide lack a governmentally issued photo ID.
So Barbara, you mentioned people of color. I want to pull something up here on my laptop. And Ari, I know you know this story because I believe you spoke to the person in question here. This is an open editorial, My Brush with North Carolina Voter ID Law. This was something that happened at the primaries. This is a man, an Indian man, about 66 years old, who says what happened to him when he went to the polling stations is that he was asked to spell his name, basically given a test. Can you explain what happened, Ari?
Yeah, so I actually talked to this voter. His name was Rudy Ravindra. He's a 66-year-old Indian American. He's a retired scientist, a very bright guy. He became a U.S. citizen in 1992, and he's voted ever since. And basically, he was given what he called a spelling bee test. He has a driver's license. He brought it to the polls, but instead of actually just looking at his driver's license, confirming his identity and letting him vote, the poll worker held it face down and made him spell his name very slowly, which he viewed as intimidating. Then the same thing happened to his wife when she voted at a different time. And none of his white neighbors were subjected to the same kind of test. There was another
Is it too
story.
much of a stretch, Ari, before you get to your other story, is it too much of a stretch to say that, I mean, for me personally, this harkens back to some of the literacy tests that my ancestors were given when they went to the polls. African Americans were told
I think it's a literacy
to take
test.
a test.
Yeah, I think it's a literacy test, and I think it's racial profiling.
Yes.
Because the fact is, all they needed to do was look at his license and check that to the name on the voter rolls, and that's all they needed to do. There was no reason they needed to put it face down, do the same thing to his wife, and I was just going to add, the same thing happened to a Nigerian American who voted in North Carolina too. So now there are 3 cases of this happening, and this is the problem with
Let me
things
just
like voter
say,
ID
all
laws.
of that's illegal already, though. I mean, without the Voter Rights Act, that's illegal. You're not allowed to do that. You don't need the Voter Rights Act. I mean, people are creeps, and there's a lot of racists out there, a lot of bigots out there, and some of them may end up being poll workers. But that's already a crime. They committed crime under state law already, and so I don't know what state that allows you to add a new poll test on top of anything. So, I think that oftentimes the facts are the facts. You look at the facts as it is right now, and frankly, I think that the Voter Rights Act did its job. I think that people are empowered to get out and vote, and they are, and they're doing so actually in most places numbers above their white counterparts. And I think that we have enfranchised the people, and I think that oftentimes now, and there's no offense to you, but most groups, they don't have any purpose unless they keep people scared and keep people, and frankly, there's a value to it because you can continue to add money, continue to add power, and you can essentially be a voter get out mechanism for liberal agendas and for the Democrat Party. And that's frankly, I think what most of these organizations really are doing is just working to continue to get out the vote to try to.
So we did put out
I
a
really
question.
I really like how Bob mentioned creating a level of fear, because what we've seen from rhetoric from Republicans is creating this level of fear about brown and black people taking over this country. How many times do we see commercials, especially in Arizona, about illegal immigrants, terrorists coming through the border to attack us and then create these horrific circumstances that will not happen. Another thing that we talk about is that all these states that have introduced these voter restrictive measures are all states that were under the Voting Rights Act. So if it was doing its job, why did we get rid of the Voter Rights Act? Why give and empower individuals in these states that have traditionally shown to have racial practices against people voting? Why have we empowered these states to introduce these mechanisms? I mean, you have a legislature here in which they are actively criminalizing people for exercising their right to vote. Governor Ducey just signed a bill earlier this year, HR 2023, that actually criminalizes our community volunteers that help people turn in their ballots. Any individual that turns in a signed and sealed ballot that is not their own can be criminalized with a Class 6
So
felony.
this prohibits volunteers really now for helping out, going to neighborhoods and asking for people's ballots to take it to them, presumably elderly, people who are immobile.
Yeah.
I want to get our community in here because I know they have a lot to say on this. Omar.
That's right. We put out the question of how much concern do people have about voter fraud, and we kind of got a lot of people who are dismissive of the idea that this is a problem. But then we also have people like Ishki over here who says, I'm more concerned about volunteers at polling places committing fraud than voters themselves. See Arizona. We have also Sarah Jones over here who says, registers of voters, town clerks, poll workers, and the vendors of the state's centralized voting system each has a duty to report problems and fraud. It is pretty obvious that there was collusion and blatant disregard for rights. Barbara, on this note, maybe it's one thing to say that there is a problem with the laws being passed and polling stations not being, and not there being enough of them. But are we going a little too far if we suggest that there is this kind of like big network of people who is trying to keep people from voting, or is this actually a legitimate concern?
Well, listen, in 2011, I created what's called the map of shame. That map showed how in 2011, beginning January 1st of that year, how state legislators around the country started working on voter suppression methods. And they all, how it came to my attention is that I started seeing the identical laws being introduced in state after state. And I said, how can these laws be identical? Because, no state legislatures in and of themselves going to come up with the same language, identical language. It turns out that it was a model bill from ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is an organization of corporations that has, a very conservative agenda. And it was driving model legislation in all these states. And before we knew it, 40 states had the identical bills trying to be introduced to suppress the vote. So let's not, get confused here. This isn't a question of my just, making up some conspiracy theory. You can go and just look at the legislation. You can go and look at what ALEC did. This is not a matter of dispute. This is a matter of history. In fact,
I think that shows a fundamental lack of understanding of how ALEC works. I mean, ALEC is a bunch of legislators from a bunch of different states. Model bills come from those legislators. So some legislator comes up and says, I have this idea for a model bill, and ALEC accepts it as a model bill, which it could come across. In fact, there are several ALEC model bills that even conflict with each other that are on both sides of the same issue.
So Bob, I hear Bob and Barbara. I hear your disagreement here. I think ALEC kind of goes a little bit too deep for our international audience. Their eyes might have glazed over a little bit as soon as we stepped into that territory. Ari, I do want to push this a little bit forward just because we are running out of time. But Barbara mentioned her 2011 map of shame. I want to show an updated map here. This is voter identification laws in effect in 2016. This is from the National Conference of State Legislatures. It shows you all the ways. It's not just voter ID requirements in some places. There are also other requirements in other places and other ways that people say these rights are being restricted. I want to know how you think, how big of an impact this might have on the upcoming election and really this election season.
I think it's going to have a very big impact because we're not just talking about voter ID laws. States have cut back on early voting. They've made it harder to register to vote. They've disenfranchised ex-felons. There's a bunch of different voting changes that have gone on at the same time, which is a dramatic escalation of what has been a very old strategy throughout American history. And if you look at what's happening in 2016, it's the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And 16 states have new voting restrictions in place for the first time. Crucial battleground states like Wisconsin, like North Carolina, like Ohio. What we saw in Arizona was if one county closes a lot of polling places, that can lead to very long lines which impact hundreds of thousands of voters. So we're not just talking about one voter here, one voter there. We're talking about many, many, many people that can be impacted by changes to election laws, by new voting restrictions.
All right.
So I absolutely think it's going to be a very big issue in November.
Okay, Ari, I'm going to pause you there. Actually, I mean, you stopped talking, so it's perfect. It's perfect just because I'm out of time. But I saw Tomas nodding there, so we're going to get to him in the post-show. It's streamed at aljazeera.com. Just enough time to tell you can catch a deeper dive into this on a documentary of People in Power coming up, airing on Al Jazeera English, What's Happening to American Democracy. For now, we'll see you online. Welcome to the Online Post Show. We're discussing controversial voting restrictions in the U.S. and the impact they're having on would-be voters. Let's get right back into that discussion. Tomas there was nodding at the end as Ari was talking. We were talking about whether or not this will have an impact on the upcoming election in November and on this election season in general. Tomas, what did you think?
Well, we've already seen the impact here in Arizona. And so what we're noticing now is that we as a nation are now having this shift of having pride in keeping people from voting. And what we need to understand is that each time these laws are allowed to be passed, and each time these laws are put into effect, they affect our most disenfranchised voters. And we're not just talking about people of color, we're talking about senior citizens, and we're talking about poor people. And until we bring back the Voting Rights Act, this will continue, along with other ways that not only votes are suppressed, but also our representation is suppressed. Redistricting and gerrymandering districts has affected many states,
I'm going to
ours.
pause you there, Tomas, because I understand gerrymandering, but I don't know that our online audience around the world does. Can you explain briefly?
Basically, gerrymandering is redesigning districts so that a select type of voter or a select group of voters are either pushed out of a certain district or included in a certain district to favor one side or the other. And so what we're seeing, especially in states like North Carolina, there's a district that literally is disconnected into two parts and is made up of one district. And these type of districts are also these types of redistricting are happening in red states, Republican-led states, in order to change the rules of the electorate so that they can continue to keep power, because we are seeing a seismic shift in demographics and also in philosophy. And we're noticing that because of this, they're rigging the game, rigging the rules so that disenfranchised voters, and also so they can pick and choose which voters are included in the elections.
What I would say, let me just break in. I mean, I apologize. I hate talking over you, but the whole idea of gerrymandering, that's exactly what the Voters' Rights Act has been doing for a long time. We have communities in South Arkansas that are close-knit communities, but only a portion of their electorate is there because the Voter Rights Act forced us to go up and spread out that majority-minority district to try to pick up a few more majority-minority districts. And what we have is legislators have to drive an hour and a half, 2 hours to get from one end of their district to the other end of their district. And we have citizens who don't even know they're legislators because they're not from the same community. And that kind of gerrymandering where you really have districts that are not a community at all is happening all the time, and it's because of the Voter Rights Act. Whereas they're going to have better representation, they're going to know their people, they're going to have better voice in government if you allow their community to be a community of one person, one vote. And frankly, I think that I want to go back to Martin Luther King and say, let's forget about the color of a man's skin and let's go after the content of the character. And the color of a man's skin should have nothing to do with how we put together a district. It ought to be the number of people who exist in a community, and that will be impacting, and that's how government changes. And I'd go back, look, where are the facts? I mean, I love this election cycle.
Is he just
going to
keep filibustering?
Yeah.
Barbara called what you did. Barbara called what you did filibustering, which of course is something that happens in Congress, where a member of Congress will talk and talk and talk so that nothing gets passed. I hear your points. I will say, Bob, that I think this might be the first time I've ever heard anyone refer to the Voting Rights Act as an example of gerrymandering.
It's in the Republican playbook. He's just reading from the playbook.
Okay, so I want to give Barbara a chance to respond briefly, and then I want to bring in our community.
But listen, the bottom line is that these legislatures that have made it their purpose to suppress the vote by all kinds of mechanisms, we talked about so many of them today. The bottom line is that the American people have to rise up, that we have to say no more, that it's up to us to build the resistance movement, to say that we're going to vote regardless, that we're going to fight and get whatever ID if we must. But once we vote, once we hold our elected officials accountable, then we can have a real democracy. But right now, what's going on is that people are trying to shrink the electorate. They're trying to make it so that very few people are able to participate in voting. It is our responsibility, our obligation to build this resistance movement, to overturn all these laws, to repeal them. I predict that the Shelby case that was passed by the Supreme, passed by the Supreme Court and decided by the Supreme Court in 2013, I predict it won't last long. That there will be a new court, that it will overturn this law, this case, because it's just based on bad law.
And of course, the Shelby case, though, you did explain it beautifully.
Yes, and that is
it is the one that it's the heart of this conversation today.
Yes.
That the Supreme Court struck down that part of the Voting Rights Act.
So I don't want this all to be doom and gloom, because I think people can make a difference.
An interesting thing, you mentioned making it difficult,
Yes.
for people to vote, but we actually got a new perspective that I had never heard before coming through our online community. Actually, it's tweets that we found. It's not really from our community directly. We have Jonah over here who says voting should be more difficult so people will value it more. And we have Neil over here echoing that sentiment, saying voting should be inconvenient. It weeds out those who are unfit to vote. Ari, what do you think of arguments like this?
Well, that's exactly been the argument historically throughout American history that has led to people being disenfranchised. That's why at the founding of our republic, only white male property owners could cast a ballot. And that was the argument during Jim Crow, and we had things like poll taxes and literacy tests that disenfranchised African American voters. And that was the argument against women voting. So, I mean, that argument's been out there throughout American history of people believing that certain people shouldn't vote. I think it's incredibly disturbing that some people, like Jonah Goldberg, who was a well-known conservative columnists, still hold that view, but it's not a new view. The other thing I'll say about the Voting Rights Act is there is tons of gerrymandering in states that were never subject to the Voting Rights Act. So you can't blame the Voting Rights Act for gerrymandering. What the Voting Rights Act said was that in states where there were no black representatives, no Hispanic representatives, no Asian American representatives, that they had to have an opportunity to be elected. Because before 1965, there was no representation in most of the country for voters of color. And so the Voting Rights Act allowed that to happen for the first time. Now, some people have taken advantage of it to create districts that are so gerrymandered and so safe that there'll never be a competitive election. But to blame the Voting Rights Act for gerrymandering when gerrymandering has been going on since the beginning of this country, I think is a little unfair.
Tomas, Bob, go ahead, because I actually want to give Tomas the last word because we haven't heard from him. But Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I agree. It's gone on and it will go on for political reasons. I mean, it's just that's the nature of politics. But what I would say is because of the Civil Rights Act, you have gerrymandering where you try to create more majority districts. And that's something that we were under, majority minority districts, which is something that we're under that really divides up and splits up communities. And that is a product of it. Now, would they still have divided that up? We've been under Democrat control forever. Maybe they would have still divided it up in order to increase the number of Democrat districts. I don't know. But the reason they gave for it was in compliance with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I would agree that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 did its job and it yanked the power out of the states that were acting so egregiously and was suppressing the vote and was preventing that representation. I'm just going to say it's 50 years later. We're not the same, and it's just it's lost its relevancy.
So you say it's lost its relevancy. Barbara says it's worse.
It's
I'm
worse.
going to give the last word to Tomas there because I haven't heard his voice in a while. Tomas, I am actually interested in your thoughts on the point that Barbara raised earlier. She says this is still up to the people. We're going to vote regardless. I'm wondering what you would tell people who have to work, can't really take that much time off of work, know that they might have a 6 to 8 hour wait at a polling station. Are they still going to feel that same urgency that Barbara is saying is necessary for this to vote? What you would tell them?
So I think everything that's going on is the definition of injustice. I mean, when you think about all that statement right there, when you talk about people have to work 6 to 8 hours, you're also talking about the low wage worker that in many times can't take the time off or can't get time away from work to be able to vote. And we talk to people as much as we can. And so for us, the mailing ballot has been excellent in getting more folks out to vote. As you can see, because more people started voting through the mail-in ballot, especially people of color, now there's a law to criminalize those volunteers. What we're seeing is not just that people have to step up, but we need real leadership, and we need real leaders at the legislature to see that this is ingrained as a very, very difficult and evil way to suppress voters. I mean, you have to combine every single effort. Yes, people will argue to say that Arizona's ID is only $12. Well, with the low wages that we experience here in Arizona, it could take a person over an eighth of their day just to be able to afford that ID. And these are low wage workers that can't take time off to go and vote and stand in line for 4 hours because they'll lose their job. And so what we're seeing is the criminalization of people of color plus low wages combined with these voter suppression efforts are designed to keep the most disenfranchised voters in our nation from voting and exercising their voice. And we talk to individuals, we speak to them at the doors, we have these conversations, we have these forums, but it's difficult to reach every single individual in an entire state. If you look at Texas, 600,000 voters were disenfranchised in 2014 because of that. It is very difficult to speak to 600,000 people in a short time frame. Yes, we need people to step up and make sure they vote, but at the same time, these types of legislation and these types of laws are exactly the reason why the Voting Rights Act should not have been removed, because as Bob said, it was doing its job. And the last time I remember, if you're doing a good job, you usually don't get fired.
All right, so some agreement there. I'm going to pause our conversation there because I know there's not going to be agreement that follows. I want to thank all of our guests. Tomas, you were just hearing from Barbara, Ari, and Bob for joining us today. Don't forget, you can catch a deeper dive into this conversation on People and Power's documentary that's running on Al Jazeera, What's Happening to American Democracy. Here's the landing page for that. You can get more on that. It's a two-part series. It's fascinating and what this means for the election season and what this means for the November election. AlJazeera.com. I'll give the very, very last word to our community, Omar.
I'll leave with a couple of positive thoughts of people suggesting how to make the voting process better in the country. We have Dandelion over here saying, I'd love to see polling spots on college campuses. And then we have Unstable Operating System, great name there, saying to fix things, standardize voting in all states, make an amendment to make voting a right, and have publicly funded elections.
I know there'll be people that have something to say about that, making it publicly funded, but that's for another time. Thanks for joining us here. We'll see you online.